Drawing can be impulsive and lyrical and off the cuff, shoot from the hip, responding quickly to what is before your eye. This is particularly true for trained artists rapidly sketching, making, for example, gesture drawings. Working quickly to a time constraint creates a kind of intense focus in and of itself, one that requires rapid action as the drawer tries to put down as much observed information as possible in a limited amount of time. The more you have drawn, the better you get at this sort of thing. But this approach doesn't work so well for people like us in a basic drawing course. As you have discovered, I'm making the case not just for drawing as an aesthetic art form and tool for design, but as a way of intensely focusing, meditating if you will, on objects in our vision of the world, a type of observation that often seems to me to be in the process of being misplaced by mass humanity inflicted with a plague of mass media images. Describing form with light and shade can also be done quickly, particularly with washes, and many trained artists in the past and present used it and use it very effectively, particularly for sketching. But we are going to start with drawing, not washes, though perhaps some of you will give washes a go later on. And I am going to urge you to go very slow with this, to take lots of time to train your eye and mind to recognize and even imagine clearly what is in light and shade on the objects before you. If you are working this course online, you will want to find something to draw that is absent of color or has very little of it. In the classroom, I will provide objects. Traditionally, art students at the limited number of art colleges that existed in the past would draw and then paint for months or even years from collections of plaster casts of classical sculpture. At my college, the priceless collection of plaster casts was smashed during a Fluxus happening event sort of thing in the early 70s, a few years prior to my arrival, and an event encouraged by quote-unquote forward-thinking instructors who wanted, apparently, to destroy everything that went before them. We also want to try and draw objects devoid of color so that we also want to try and draw objects devoid of color so that we can more clearly study the effects of light and shade on form. As you begin to see the light, so to speak, it will become easier to discriminate between the effects of light and shade and local color. And you could try later to use objects with local color, that is, objects that are inherently colored. Start with something fairly simple. I'm going to go through the exercise of shading for the first time here by just drawing and shading a white ball. We'll go on to draw and shade a number of matte white objects so that you can see the approach. If you are doing this course online, I will post an image that you can bring up on your monitor and draw if you can't find something around the house. The first thing we need to do is make a light line drawing of our subject. Here it is. Not too hard with a ball. But if you are drawing something more complex, you will need to take your time and measure angles and proportions. Notice as well, upper right, I have created a rough value scale in the margin that will provide some guidance for me in terms of applying tonal values. You should do the same. I will be building up tone by using the side of the crayon in much the same way I might apply a series of washes to a watercolor. I've got 5 tones up there on the margin, including black and white, and this seems sufficient to me. You could try more or less. Nuanced gradations between one tone and another will inevitably occur as you shade gradations. I've also created some other value swatches down below there with hatching, that is, drawing parallel lines, and cross-hatching, which involves drawing 2 sets of parallel lines that crisscross. Essentially, you can hatch and then cross-hatch multiple times in a number of directions, gradually darkening your darks. More than that, I find myself both shading using the side of the crayon and then hatching on top, and you'll see this unravel in my demos, particularly the kinds of materials I'm using. This allows a subtle nuancing of tones, and as well, I like the sense of surface that the hatching provides. It provides a kind of tactile quality to the drawing. Materials. If you are working from a large newsprint pad on an easel, I'll recommend Conte, especially in the pencil holder. You can shade with the side of the Conte, at which time the Conte doesn't have to be sharp. If you start hatching, you will want to sharpen the Conte with a knife. Likewise, when you sketch your drawing initially with those light lines. In this case, I'm using a sketchbook with a nice tooth and a bright cartridge paper. So I'm using a Nero, that is a softer, darker crater color crayon in my Kohinoor clutched crayon holder. I've got an eraser handy too. The first thing I'm doing is to look closely at my subject and discover what is in full light. What is there? What is there that I want to leave as white as the paper? Highlights, if you will. Probably not a lot. I will put a light tone, perhaps the lightest value, or perhaps a mid to light value over everything that is not in full direct light. That is, everything. I'll put the tone over everything that is in some degree of shade. As I do this, there's a risk I'll smudge with my hand, or smudge what I've done already with my hand. I usually place a sheet of paper under the heel of my hand to prevent this, like so. Now I look closely again and lay down another tone, a bit darker, over everything I perceive to be in a greater degree of shade. Then again, I add another darker value from my value scale over everything I perceive to be another degree darker. And one more time. I've got a close to finished drawing, but I'll now put down my darkest darks and I'll use some hatching and cross-hatching for this to provide some nuanced gradations that create that sense of surface. If something has gone too dark, I'll lighten it by dabbing with the kneaded eraser. So I'm done. There you go. You'll notice that I've altered the background somewhat. For these exercises, I like a dark, simple background to accentuate the object, and am heavy-handed with the crayon, particularly in the background, to create a sense of chiaroscuro, of strong contrast between light and shade. I could draw this ball a number of times with subtly different approaches to how it reads against the background. I could create gradations in the background from light to dark, from top to bottom, or from bottom to top, or side to side, or even one side or the other, or even angled one way or the other. Or I can modulate the background in tone variously in various areas to allow for the ball to sometimes read darker than the background and sometimes lighter. I hope you can see a bit of that if you look closely. I want the object to appear to be form emerging from shadows through illumination. As I've mentioned, I'm fairly heavy-handed, but much like exposure in photography, I might have been even heavier-handed with the crayon and the degree of lighting. That is, I might have made my drawing even more underexposed or lower key, darker. Or I could have made it a bit lighter, or more quote-unquote underexposed, that is, higher key. Each of you will have your own preferences on this matter, which are personal and can be thought of as potentially stylistic. The technical considerations remain the same regardless. A couple of other things to notice before we move on to our next subject. Notice the dark core through the middle. This is created because the direct light illuminates one side and then often is bounced back in the form of a secondary light that re-illuminates the shaded side. Fortuitously, the lightest lights and the darkest darks are close together sort of in the middle of the ball, and this creates contrast, which makes that dark and light boundary pop forward. Think about the shape of the ball, and you will have to agree that the dark core area in the center of the ball, adjacent to the lightest lights, is in fact closest to your eye. This effect really helps to give a sense of volume and form. Even if your subject lacks this phenomenon, it would often be prudent, unless you are drawing something far, far away, to create this effect to some degree. Think of the nose on a face. To make it seem closest to the viewer, you want your darkest darks and lightest lights there to create the contrast to make the schnoz pop forward. In a way, we can use the actual phenomenon of aerial perspective of sorts on objects so close to the viewer it should not actually apply, still lifes and figures. We can knock things back by reducing the contrast and bring things forward by increasing it. This pushing and pulling is another way of creating depth in a picture plane, as would, for example, overlapping shapes. Let's take another pass at lighting and shading form, this time with a styrofoam display head. Here is the finished drawing. The light is coming from the windows off to the right and raking across the face. Half of the face is essentially in shade. I might be convinced that the bulbous head's right eye, the one we see on our left, is catching direct light, but I'm not going to fall for that. It is catching some light somehow, probably from the other end of the garage, but I'm not going to consider it direct light. I'm treating it as a non-direct illumination, so I'm considering it in shade. Light has to be coming from an extremely low angle to strike the eyeball. I would say it just about does on the head's left eye, the one you can see on the right, but only a bit at the bottom and on the eyelid. It is rare for the so-called whites of the eyes to be illuminated, yet amateur artists typically do this instinctively, giving their subject an eerie, zombie-like appearance. Light rarely hits the eyeball, but you may well see glints or reflections in them. It's sort of like a mirror. It's not the same thing. There have been a couple of abominable restorations in Spain in recent years in which the restorers seem to know nothing about drawing and lighting form. One of these was the Blessed Virgin, which strongly displays complete ineptitude in regard to treatment of the eyes as well as in drawing. Whoever restored it gave the Virgin classic amateur zombie eyes. A second attempt corrected the zombie eyes, but whoever did it also could not draw or paint with even a modicum of facility. Here's a wash self-portrait I made to illustrate the problem. I carefully looked at my own face to decide exactly where the direct light was striking and where it was not, and then applied a wash. No light struck my eyeballs whatsoever. A bit struck the lids on the lit side of the face, but the eyeballs are tucked under the lids and also under the brow. It's difficult to get light in there. An amateur might do something like this. Here's another drawing and wash self-portrait. Again, touch of light on the lids on the one side, but nothing on the eyeballs. Unusually, I've put a lot of detail on the shade side. This is not always necessary. Look at these faces from film and television and see how the whole eye sockets have been eliminated. There's an illustration thrown in there too. On this Rembrandt painting we looked at earlier, the eyes can be seen, but detail is reduced to mere dabs of paint. Generally speaking, painters eliminate or soften or obfuscate detail in shade. Here's that CGI grisaille face we looked at earlier. Look closely at the value of gray in the eyes in comparison to skin on the face. The eyeballs are in fact in shade. In the classroom, I get students to look their neighbors in the eye and assess the value of the whites of the eye and decide whether or not they are in light or shade, and realize how they really have to be knocked back and made darker. Here are some more examples from both film, painting, and illustration that clearly show how in general lighting the whites of the eyes are not illuminated. Pause and look closely if you will. Sometimes you'll get a reflective glint, which is similar to what a mirror does, but it is not direct illumination. There will be exceptions, and when you see them, it's worth thinking about the circumstances of these exceptions. Back to drawing our drawing of the styrofoam head. Here's the initial line drawing, and again I've provided myself with a swatch of 5 values from black to white. I put a light tone over everything I perceive to be in shade. This is crucial and requires intense looking and an honest appraisal of what I am seeing. I often think that drawing involves a kind of critical thinking. I know critical thinking is such a buzzword or shibboleth these days that everybody seems to be throwing around, but there's something in that. Then I follow up with another darker tone within that which is already shaded. And I do it again. We can clearly begin to see a sense of form and volume emerging. And one final tone of darkest darks, and again some cross-hatching because I like the aesthetic effect. Here it is finished. Now, having pointed all this out and made light of amateur zombie eyes, allow me to show you an accomplished artist who also lights the whites of the eyes. It is one thing to create zombie eyes out of ignorance, but quite another to do so, or come close to doing so, out of great experience. One last thing. I did a live classroom style demo of actually drawing the planes of the head, which may or may not be available when you watch this. I might replace it with 2 videos. Unfortunately, my camera stops working after about 15 minutes, so I never did finish the rendering demo. So here are the iterations of the classroom style quick demo using the planes of the head. And that's it for describing the form of matte objects with light and shade. I'm going to follow up this video with another that suggests how you can do some portraiture exercises at home on your own time, and also demonstrate ways to approach drawing shiny and translucent objects. The point will be that the approach is the same. In my classroom situations, I don't usually have the time to get into rendering shiny objects, so the next video will be a bit of a bonus, and drawing objects with luster can be great fun.